Once upon a time, it wasn't uncommon for console manufacturers to release add-on hardware that dramatically changed their game system. The PC Engine had a CD-ROM add-on. Sega had their Sega CD and 32X. Nintendo had the 64DD. And Coleco had the Atom. Despite being spread across 15 years of video game history, you might notice a bit of a pattern with these add-ons. They were a really bad idea. The most successful of those were the CD-ROM add-ons, where the technological edge of the medium let them drive some sales. But the rest were unmitigated disasters. Sometimes company-wrecking disasters. It took a while, but console manufacturers eventually learned that splitting your user base is a really stupid idea. The owners of that add-on will be a fraction of your system's install base, and thus sales for any game on that platform will be a fraction of that fraction. But it's a lesson that everyone had to learn, and Nintendo learned it with the Famicom Disk System. The Famicom Disk System was born from one simple problem. ROM chips were expensive. The way that video game distribution worked for Nintendo's Family Computer was that pre-programmed ROM chips on PCBs were distributed in plastic housings and plugged into the system through an edge connector. In other words, it had cartridges. Those ROM chips were pretty much the most expensive thing in the game. If another storage medium could be used, say magnetic disks, then the cost of manufacturing games would be cut in half. And if you could cut game prices, then maybe people would buy more games. And since a trade deal was in the works that would dramatically increase the price of chips, getting ahead of it and switching mediums seemed like a good idea. And there was one other major consideration Nintendo had when designing their disk system. The Family Computer was pretty much at its end of life. Games were already pushing up against the system's limits. Super Mario Bros. Was about as far as you could go on the platform. The Family Computer just couldn't read any more memory than that. There were other limitations that they were running into as well, but those are a lot more technical, so we'll skip over that. While it was technically possible to expand a system's readable memory through a process of swapping around which blocks it was looking at, something like that would require another chip, and that's expensive. We're trying to get rid of those expensive chips. It's not like add-on hardware would ever become cheap enough to be included in every single Famicom game. And so the Family Computer Disk System was born. I'm going to say I'm really glad that Nintendo eventually adopted the popular shorthand Famicom. Family Computer is just really clunky. The Famicom Disk System, or FDS, consisted of two hardware components: the RAM adapter and the disk drive. Now, considering it's called the Disk System, you'd expect that the disk drive would be the important thing, but it's not actually doing all that much. The real magic is in that black module on top of the Famicom, the RAM adapter. It contained a whopping 48K of RAM. That's 48 kilobytes. Or enough to store roughly 1/3 of any given frame of this video. Most of that was dedicated to holding the program loaded from disk. The way that a cartridge game works is that the Famicom didn't store any information itself. It just went and asked the cartridge for what it needed at any given moment. That's not really something you can do from a floppy disk, so the RAM adapter basically acted as a cartridge that could update its programming. The RAM adapter also added one additional sound channel. That channel was based on wavetable synthesis, a process that allowed for more complex sound than the standard Famicom. It makes a lot of the Famicom Disk System games sound unlike anything else out there. The gist of the method is that in the 1980s there were a handful of ways to get a computer to make sound, and then these were combined in various ways. A sine wave where the audio is regular, a square wave where the oscillations are very sharp-edged, noise where essentially random voltages are sent through the speaker. Those weren't the only options, but those were the ones that were native to the Famicom. Wavetable synthesis used pre-programmed shapes, essentially audio samples. And then the system could tinker with the amplitude or frequency to modify that sample. It's table synthesis because they essentially have a list of values to send through the audio channel, and are just following that table. For the disk system, this table has to be pretty small, so you won't find speech samples getting used with it. Still, a creative sound engineer could use this to make a lot of interesting noises. I have greatly simplified this explanation, and people can and have dedicated their lives and careers just to methods of digital sound. I think I've given you enough, though, to understand why the disk system can sound weird. The final important thing in the RAM adapter is the drive controller. It's what's actually doing all the hard work of running the disk drive. The drive itself, well, it's a motor to spin the platter, some magnetic heads, and the connections to pass the data back. Also, a little bit of hardware to manage the power for the drive, because that big boy is not powered by the Famicom. Instead, it has a battery compartment for 6 C-cell batteries. These have a surprisingly long lifespan in the unit. Getting about 6 months of play out of those batteries isn't unheard of. However, if you're a heavy-duty Famicom Disk System user, then you'll want to get the power adapter. It's just an external power brick that was an optional accessory. Of course, that means that between the TV, the Famicom, and the disk system, you'll need 3 outlets. And 2 of them have nice big wall warts. So I think you can see why Nintendo included the battery option. The drives are notoriously finicky, especially after 40 years. The motor doesn't spin the disk directly, there's a drive belt and gears in between. And since that drive belt is rubber, it tends to rot away. And replacing it and getting the heads realigned so that they will read the discs properly is actually kinda finicky. It could be worse, though. Since Sharp had a deal with Nintendo to produce their own Famicom hardware, they produced twin Famicom systems, which were all-in-one units with the regular Famicom and the disk system combined. And those are notorious for being nearly impossible to replace that drive belt. Now to get to the reason that we're all here. The discs. The disk system discs are a very slight variation on Mitsumi Electronics' quick disk format. Not an especially popular floppy disk format, but it was pre-existing technology. The discs are a bit smaller than a standard 3.5-inch floppy. They're two-sided, and each side holds about 56 kilobytes. The maximum size for a Famicom cartridge was 40 kilobytes. So with 2 sides, you are getting almost 3 times the space for games. Small games might only use one side of the disc, but before long it became common to have the program data and the start screen on side A, then you'd turn it over and load the graphics data and levels from side B. Of course, one of the strengths of a floppy disk is that it's not a permanent storage medium. You can write to them, and that made it easy to create games that allowed people to save their progress. Something that would never be possible on a standard Famicom cartridge. I mean, unless they wanted to put a battery and RAM chip inside it, but that would be really expensive, so no one would ever do that. The ability to rewrite discs, however, also led Nintendo to come up with a new low-cost game distribution option. Someone could buy a Famicom Disk System game, and then when they're tired of the game that they bought, take it into a retailer where they would encounter a disc writer kiosk. These machines, which were part of the plan right from the start with the disk system, would let you put in your floppy disk, and then select a new game that you'd like to have copied to it. A disk system game on its own typically retailed for about 3,000 yen, while getting a copy of a game from one of these machines cost about 500 yen. Now after you had run the machine, you were supposed to take your disc over to the clerk, who would give you a new label for it, and they would sell you the instruction manual for another 100 yen. This did not always happen, and it could be one reason that you'd get a Famicom Disk System game where the game on the disc didn't match the label. I'll get to the other, much more likely reason in a minute. Some of the disc writer kiosks had a built-in fax machine where they would take information from the player's discs and send that information back to Nintendo. That was used for certain contests that were held. These disk writer kiosks lasted into the early 90s, and you could send one of your floppy disks back to Nintendo to have it rewritten all the way until 2003. Of course, since Nintendo could rewrite disks, theoretically, so could anyone else. Fortunately, Nintendo had two copy protection schemes in place. First, who used quick disks? It was an unpopular format. No one was going to have those laying around. The outer casing for the floppy disks with the Famicom Disk System had enough differences from the regular quick disk that it couldn't just fit into a drive. Unless somebody were to, say, pop open a disk and switch it around. But that's just crazy talk, and theoretical, and this video definitely doesn't violate the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. Second, when you put a disk into the disk system, a set of molded metal contacts descended. These fit into the I and the third N in the Nintendo logo that had been molded into the disk. If they didn't descend fully, then the disk didn't work in the system. It's unclear exactly how long it took pirates to defeat this copy protection, but if it was more than an hour, I am severely disappointed in them. The copy protection was laughably trivial to break, and as a result, piracy for these games was rampant. It's created a situation where collecting Famicom Disk System games is a bit of a mess. It takes effectively no effort for anyone to write anything to one of these floppy disks, both in 1986 and today. I can do it right now. In fact, I have done it with some of my disks in order to make the program on the disk match the label. The people who copied the games on day one might have had to use their computers to do it, and then made the really obvious modification to those disks to let them work in the disk system. But Nintendo gave you a floppy drive. All you needed was a little bit of software and you could totally copy that floppy. The gist of all this means there's really no such thing as an authentic Famicom Disk System game. The best you can do is verify the packaging. And even that is trivial to fake. So, as a Famicom collector, I really do not recommend collecting Famicom Disk System games. All you're buying is a label, and probably not an original label. And when it comes to later games that were only released to the disc writer kiosk, well, how do you even go for authentic with that? Collecting for the disk system is a mess. Just don't do it. There were 191 games released for the Famicom Disk System, and over the course of the next year, I'm going to cover all of them in turn. That's a little bit more than a game every other day. If you've watched this channel before, you're probably familiar with Fami Daily, where I went through the entire Famicom system library, one game at a time, day by day, for 3 years. So this schedule will finally let me take a bit of a break. Though knowing me, I'll still probably be making videos about weird things that pop into my head as I go. The schedule means for 2 weeks it's a game every other day, and then there's an episode 2 days in a row, and then it goes back to skipping every other day. I'm going to talk about all of the official Famicom Disk System game releases. The open nature of the platform meant that there were unofficial games that were released, but almost all of those are porn games. Not especially YouTube friendly, and honestly, not very good either. I am going to be doing a few videos on releases that were not commercially available. There were a couple of particularly infamous ones that I don't want to skip over. About 1/3 of the disk system library were games that were also released on the Famicom. So I've actually talked about many of these before. I'm still going to cover them here though. Maybe we'll find something different in this particular version. Also, maybe I'll be in a totally different mood when I reach the game this time, and have a dramatically different opinion about it. And as with the Famicom, I will be playing all of these games on original, unmodified hardware. Of the 7 launch titles for the Famicom Disk System, all 7 were released as Famicom cartridges, 6 of which were released as cartridges before the disk system launched. I'll reach the first new to this channel game on January 14th. There's one more thing to mention about the disk system that doesn't really fit in with what I'm doing, playing all of the games, but I know people want to hear about it. And that's how the Disk System has a mascot. Disk-kun, this anthropomorphized Disk System disc, shows up all over the place with Disk System stuff. Disk-kun only rarely makes appearances in games, but they're always lurking around somewhere. Okay, you've got the background. Now it's time to dive in and see what this add-on brought to the Famicom.